Appreciate you all being here. Before we start, as usual, I'm just going to place the link in the chat in case anybody wants to catch up on anything or review anything. That's all there, along with our any of the links that are that we have. So that's all in the chat. I just placed that. If you'd like to review or if you'd like to catch up, wherever you're up to. But again, thank you for joining us today. We are nearing the end, not quite there, but we're nearing the end of the third chapter of Kohelet. We've past couple weeks we've been discussing. I mean, for the past while now, we've been discussing the idea of happiness and how happiness plays a role with wisdom, particularly. How is it? How the relationship between happiness and wisdom, and how it is that a person can go about finding joy and happiness from the physical world. And again, as we saw in the weeks before, King Solomon has a hard time saying that it can't exist, right? He says it must exist, but how do you achieve it? And again, as we saw, he laid out a whole roadmap to getting there. But included in that was the basic general premise that control is where we tend to run into most of our issues with happiness, right? Whenever a person is trying to control something that it cannot control, that's where they're going to run into an inability to find happiness. So all the riches and all the wealth in the world cannot make it that a person leaves a legacy afterwards, nor can it stop the inevitable from happening. And so in that case, there is a level of control that a person doesn't have, and realizing that and recognizing where a person's abilities end and where, so to speak, fate takes over is a path towards happiness, a major path towards happiness. And what we saw last week is that he introduced us to a new idea, which is that another place where we find happiness, and particularly happiness from the physical, from the material world, is in the idea of doing good. All right. If a person uses their material for the good, that's as he's explaining, it's a path towards happiness. Now, he has not yet explained what good is, all right, and he's going to spend a lot of time discussing that as we go on. But first, he kind of gets into the side point. Not really a side point; it's the main idea, and that's what we saw last week, or we started seeing last week. We'll continue this week, is where he's going to be discussing the really where you find one of the greatest places of one of the places where there's a need for good deeds, for people to do good. We got into a little discussion last week, back and forth, about what the meaning of one of the recent verses was. So I'm going to jump back into the share screen so we can all take a look and see together. Let me just do that right now. Okay. Give me 1 second to get my screen set up. Okay. And with that, what we got into discussion about was verse number 14 and verse number 15 over here, where he says, I'm just going to translate. I'm not going to read the Hebrew because it's not what we're focusing on this week. It says, I know, based on everything that I've seen, I now know that everything that God has done will last forever. Upon it, there is no ability to add, and from it, there's no one has the ability to subtract. And God does this in order so that they will act with awe or fear before him. And then he says, that which was, that which will be, sorry, my mistake. Again, the tenses screw me up a little bit. That which is right now, always was, and that which that will be, already was. And what God does is that he looks after, or he searches out the one who is chaste, literally. All right, that's this word near duff, the one who is chaste. In other words, what I called last week is the underdog. So what I was trying to give over from these verses over here is this idea that there is a reality in this world of a inequality. Again, that's a pretty weighted word nowadays. That's a word that comes up pretty often in our culture. But I mean it just in its literal sense, that there's an inequality amongst different people. right? Some people have more, some people have less. And there's an inability for a society as a whole to rectify that issue, right? And I would say the proof to this is that no matter what economic model that we've used in the past, you're always going to end up with some people who are marginalized and some people who are better off, right? Even take the most extreme case of communism. That's the whole animal farm, right? All pigs are created equal, just some are more equal than others, right? So no matter what, you're going to end up with some imbalance in people's lifestyles, whatever it is, right? And he says on that, there is no ability to add or to subtract, meaning that you end up hitting a certain point where you just cannot do anything about it. Now, does that say that you don't have an obligation to do anything about it? No. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. As a society, we do have an obligation, particularly to our most marginalized members. And it's our job to make sure that they are taken care of. Now, will it be possible? That's not in our hands to figure out, but it is up to us to do something about it. And that's this last statement over here, that God looks out for the underdog. Not necessarily looks out as in he guards the underdog, but what he does is he searches Yevakesh et Nirdaf. Again, that means that he looks to see what's going on with that person. Is that person being reached out to? It's a bad sentence structure. Are we reaching out to that person? Are we taking the steps that are in our grasp to help that person?
I have a question.
Yes.
Does King Solomon offer any justification or evidence to declare that God looks after the Nirdaf?
That's a good question. I don't see that in our verses necessarily. I'll grant you that. I don't necessarily see that. Perhaps we'll get into it later. I don't know. But I have not seen that. But he does state it as a statement of fact. That's a good question. Usually he backs up whatever he says with examples. But here he kind of just states that as a fact. That God looks towards, seeks out the Nirdaf. Again, this chaste person, this underdog. That's a good question. I would have to look into that some more, perhaps. And so that brings us to our first verse this week. And this is chapter 3, verse number 16, or Perek Gimel, Pasuk Tet Zayin. And that's where we're going to be starting from this week. Okay? So, he begins with saying like this. I'm going to read it all together. V'od re'iti tachat hashamesh. I have also seen under the sun. Again, that's our clue that we're talking about the physical world, the material world. I've seen under the sun, Mekom hamishpat, the place of justice, Shama Haresha. That is where the evil resides, or the wicked resides. Mekom hatzedek, and the place of righteousness, Shama Harasha. That is where the Rasha resides. Now, there's two different takes on what Rasha is. The typical understanding is Rasha is somebody who acts with Rasha, right? So Rasha being wickedness, Rasha would be a wicked person. Rashi over here, again, Rashi's kind of our king of the commentators. By using his magical Jewish grammar rules, he says that it's actually the same thing as Rasha. Just because it's at the end of the verse, it changes its vowelization. So basically, either he's just repeating the same, kind of using the same term, just he has to change the vowelization, or it's actually referring to a wicked person. So let me read that one more time. Let's actually read it both ways.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
When this was written, did they put vowels in there?
So as with all of the Torah, there's no actual vowels in the text. It's written vowelless. However, we do have a tradition of the vowelization. So, and our traditions are pretty solid.
So who's to say Russia versus Russia? Who made that distinction?
Again, that came to us through tradition. So we know that that's the vowelization. It's just that's what we have going all the way back since the times of King Solomon himself. So that's the assumption we always make, that the tradition that we have is correct. It's a good question. I mean, there's we apply this rule to all of the Torah, and again, that's there were mistakes. Historically, there have been mistakes made based on that. Perhaps the most famous to probably most people here is in the parasha 2 weeks ago. It says that Moses came down from Mount Sinai with his face shining. Right, the word that is used in Hebrew is karan, which means shining, but the translators mistook that karan as karen, which means a horn, which is why Michelangelo sculpted Moses with horns. Okay, that's probably the most famous example of a misvowelization. But actually, there's also the rabbis teach us about a fellow by the name of Yoav, who was a general for King David and who ends up being executed by King Solomon, and he also made a couple issues with the same. Made a couple miscalculations with the same issue. In too deep to get into. But yeah, we do understand that our vowelization comes from the original source itself.
Oh, Rabbi, question?
Yes.
Who made the mistake about the horns versus the shining face?
That's a good question. I'm assuming it's the Christian translators, but I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought
whatever it is, somehow by the time it gets to Michelangelo in the 1500s, he's firmly he thinks that Moses has horns,
right?
And that cave, and then all anti-Semites from then forth. So anyway, so let's read this verse one more time. Ve'odra iti tachat hashamesh, I have also seen under the sun, Makom hamishpat, the place of justice, Shama haresha, that is where you will find wickedness. There is wickedness. Makom hatzedek, and the place of righteousness, Shama harasha, that is also where you'll find wickedness, or potentially the wicked one. Okay, again, two different ways of understanding that word. So first of all, let's just address what are these two things. We have the place of justice. A place of justice, that's like a court, right? That's we would usually refer to a court as a place of mishpat, of justice. Now, the thing about a court is a court doesn't necessarily have to have righteous people in it. A court can be manned with unfaithful or unrighteous people. And that's exactly what he's kind of pointing out here, is the place of justice itself is full of wicked people. And that's historically happened tons and tons of times, to the point where at the end of the Second Temple era, the court, the high court, the Sanhedrin, was actually infiltrated by groups of wicked people who were trying to misinterpret the Torah. That's again how we have it in our tradition. So we do find that the place of justice does not necessarily have to be manned by righteous people. But then he adds on another kind of layer to that cheesecake, and he says that the place of righteousness itself, where the righteous reside, again, not necessarily the place of justice, but where amongst the righteous, there you will also find the wicked. Okay, this is actually a concept you find in a couple different places in our literature, that even in places where the righteous are, and you have a council of the righteous, you may end up with a wicked person who ends up in there and can, unfortunately, twist the thoughts of the righteous. Again, righteous and wicked, we haven't really discussed what those things are. I do believe those are things that he does get into later in the book. So we're not necessarily describing what is righteousness or wickedness. But we do find that the place of justice and the counsel of the righteous do seem to can be infiltrated by the wickedness. Okay, the wickedness, whatever that wickedness is. My understanding over here is that he's cluing us onto something. And again, following what we just said in the past verses, that there is a reality of inequality, of marginalization, of the fact that there are groups of people that are never going to, that try as we might, will never quite fit into the fold. And what he's saying over here is that there's also systems in place. We have systems in place to try and rectify that issue. We have the place of justice. We have the counsel of the righteous. And nevertheless, you will still find wickedness rear its ugly head in those places. The idea being that we are supposed to be using these places and these systems to benefit those, particularly those who have been marginalized. And it's there that you'll find that it's not being done. And again, this is King Solomon cluing us in again on this what is this good? What are these good deeds that need to be done with the material world, with the material possessions that a person has? Well, here's a place where goodness is lacking, and it's taking care of the downtrodden, taking care of the weak, taking care of those who are not part of the main group. I mean, we're Jews, right? for the most part, this is kind of like a second nature to the Jewish people, right? We always are looking out and trying to take care of all of the downtrodden and untended of the world. At least in the recent century or so, that's definitely been a major focus and goal of the Jewish people. And here you find King Solomon speaking this out, that this is a goal of Judaism. This is a goal of us as the wise person, of the person who's seeking to benefit even themselves, even from a selfish place. Well, I want to find happiness with my material possessions. Well, here's a place where my material possessions can be put to use and can help. I can do a good deed with it, because the systems that are put into place to protect those who are the most vulnerable, those systems are rotten from the inside, and that's something that we have to take care of. He speaks out even again in the next verse. What is the fate of such a place? So, without further ado, I think I'll jump into the next verse over here. That's verse number 17. Just give me 1 second. Okay. And he says, Amarti ani belibi, I have said in my heart. Again, the heart being the objective reasoning system, his way of thinking, right? So I've said in my heart, et hatzadik ve'et harasha yishpota elokim. Both the righteous and the wicked, God will judge. Okay? Ki eit l'chol chayfetz, because there is a time for all chayfetz. We've discussed that before. Chayfetz being literally an item, but it's also kind of this idea of desire. It's something that you pursue. V'al kol ha'maaseh sham, and for all the action that is there. Okay, again, a very strange sentence structure, so we'll read that again. Amarti ani belibi, I have said in my heart, et hatzadik ve'et harasha yishpot elokim, that the righteous and the wicked God will judge. Ki eit l'chol chayfetz, because there's a time for all chayfetz, for all items. Va'al kol ha'maaseh sham, and for all the actions there. Again, strange sentence structure.
Rabbi, just an observation.
Yes.
You usually indicate a strange sentence structure when the verse talks about Amarti ani belibi. So it seems to me like his understanding of his libi might be a little bit, he might be looking through some kind of a lens that encourages this strangeness. I think that if you go back and look at all the times that you've said this sentence structure is strange, there's always some perspective from a libi
Interesting.
that invokes that.
Maybe he's sensing a confusion in his own heart that's it kind of makes his words themselves confusing. It's a possibility. I'm curious about that. That's very interesting. I would have to look back and kind of see the examples, but I think you're thinking about it. You're probably right. Yeah. Again, this verse is kind of divided into two parts. So the first part is, again, I've said in my heart that both the righteous and the wicked God will judge. Okay, this is clearly the follow-up of the last verse, where he says, "Hey, where the very systems that are put into place to protect the vulnerable, those very systems are places of wickedness. They seem to be full of wickedness or wicked people, and on that I'm saying that it's not just the wicked person who's going to be held accountable for this; it's also the righteous person." Okay, so meaning to say that a person cannot just sit back and say, listen, the systems are in place. What am I supposed to do about it? Clearly, there's a call to action over here that the righteous person, and we always assume that we're on the righteous side, right? So the righteous person is also held accountable for the actions of the wicked person. Right? It's up to us to take a stand against wickedness. And he's kind of getting off track over here, which it's all one big track, but he's kind of getting off from his main point of how to do good with your material possessions. But he's on a roll over here, and he's saying that this is a major thing, a major aspect of wisdom, of happiness, is that you have to take a stance and you have to take some sort of action against wickedness, particularly when you find it reaching into becoming a systemic issue, right? When you have wickedness in a system, again, particularly the systems that are built for the vulnerable, it's up to the righteous to do something about that wickedness. Again, will they be successful? That's in God's hands, right? But it's at least up to us to take some sort of stance and say, to do something about it. Again, Yishpot Elokim, meaning that God will judge, does not necessarily mean that he will judge them favorably or unfavorably. It just means that he will judge them, meaning he's going to look at the actual facts and see what did the righteous person do about this. The Talmud gives us a certain idea of this when they say, famously, it says that the Pinchas ben Yair, who was one of the famous rabbis around the end of the Second Temple era. So it says that his cow would walk outside on Shabbat with adornments on its head, which is not allowed, right? It would basically carry without an eruv is basically the issue. And so the Gemara says, wait, first of all, Pinchas ben Yair, the great rabbi, is having his animal not fulfill a Shabbat, not doing what he should on Shabbos. And Pinchas ben Yair did not just have one cow; he had tens of thousands of cattle. He was a famed cattle herder, right? So, what do you mean his cow went out? So Gemara explains that no, it was actually his neighbor's cow. He had a neighbor who was, disobeying the laws of Shabbat. But someone in Pinchas ben Yair's position has an obligation to take a second to go over to the neighbor and tell them, there's something that you could fix over here. The fact that he didn't take that step, he didn't look out for the other person, it ends up on his role. Now, obviously, we don't understand how the justice system in heaven works, right? We talk about scales, we talk about Yom Kippur, and but all this stuff, this is really beyond us. But it's important to know that the righteous person is held accountable for the missteps of the wicked person. And more than missteps over here, we're talking about systemic issues, cultural marginalization of groups. So that's more than just a misstep. So anyway, again, that's his first point over here, that the righteous and the wicked, God will judge. And then he adds on this, he tacks on this last part of the sentence over here. He says again, Ki eit l'chol chevetz, is a time for all pursuits, Val kol ma'aseh sham, and for all the actions there. This phrase, we've seen this phrase before. It was at the beginning of our chapter, where we said that for everything there is a season and a time for all chayfetz under the sun. All right, it's the same word, that there's a time for every pursuit. And then back at the beginning of the chapter, we discussed this idea that 8 is kind of this time that we're referring to is more of a, not necessarily a predestined time. It's a spontaneous time, something that kind of pops out of nowhere. And in other words, that pursuits, the time for action can kind of pop out of anywhere. And that's in many ways kind of what we're dealing with over here. Is we're talking about the righteous person taking the stance, taking a stand against wickedness, and you never know when the time is going to be right for that. So he's saying that there is a time for that idea, for that pursuit of justice. Okay, that's part of what he's trying to say over here. But he tacks on one last thing, and he says, "Va'al kol ma'aseh sham," and for all the action there. And here's where he's bringing in this point that I've been saying, but he hasn't yet mentioned it in the verse, which is that we have to try. We have to do something, okay? Because he's saying that there's a time for pursuits and a time for action, right? This time is going on both things. So while there's and let me take a step back. When we said before at the beginning of the chapter, this phrase, "Ein l'chol chayfetz," that there's a time for all pursuits. that means that we kind of have to learn how to roll with the punches. To find happiness, we said, it's about dealing with the things that come at you as they come at you, right? That if you want to find happiness, you have to learn you have to figure out how to use what's the word I'm looking for? How to adjust your attitude as things come at you. So that's definitely what he's saying over here. We have to learn same idea, that we have to kind of do an attitude adjustment as things come by. But we also have to take an active stance. For all the action that is done over there. Okay, meaning again that he is saying that this thing that God is judging, action is part of that. We have to figure out how to take action, right? So we're like, what a perfect week to talk about this, because we're all watching with bated breath to see how the Ukrainians are going to deal with the Russians, and it's a great example of people who are thrown a tremendous curveball, and they have to learn how to adapt to it and what attitude they should take with it. As of right now, as of today, which might have changed since the last time I saw the news, but they're standing up for freedom or for whatever it is that the Russians want to take away from them. It's obviously much more complicated than that, and so it's a very complicated piece. But it's just interesting to see this right now, where we're talking about systems that are wicked and people who are righteous standing up for it. And that's, hopefully that's what people are trying to do. And hopefully that's what we try to do also, is we stand up for what's right and good and just. When we see the things being put in place that are destructive or hurtful for particularly the most vulnerable people of the group of society. So I think that's part of what he's saying over here is, again, that what is it that God is giving you is going to bring you to justice for? It's for all your pursuits, but also for the action. It's how do you deal with the spontaneous changes in life? What actions are taken, particularly again in this area that we've been talking about, of the place of justice that is filled with wickedness, and the place of righteousness that has been taken over by the wicked. Okay, and again, I have to continue to say that righteousness and wickedness have not been defined, and that's a very important point, because take any partisan political issue, every person's going to say, yeah, well, obviously my side is the righteous side, the other side is the wicked side. I'm standing up for for the righteous, for the wicked. Probably in this very group we have some people who are thinking about one thing, that they're defining one thing as righteous and one thing as wicked, and the other group is defining the other thing as righteous, and the other thing is wicked. It's the nature of things. So we have not decided yet what is righteous and wicked, but he is telling us that this is I would say that we could probably say now at this point that this is a piece of it. If somebody's not looking out for a breakdown in the system of justice, that's probably a point where you're going to find where we could lean towards wickedness. Again, not necessarily calling out. I don't think it's safe yet to say exactly what righteous and wicked is, but I think that's one thing that you're starting to glean from this, is that that's a sign of wickedness. If the systems of justice are starting to be taken over by people who don't care about making sure everyone gets a fair shake, then we have an issue. Okay, again, fair, that's another word that's not defined, right? So what's a fair shake? That's we're a good couple hundred years into this discussion, so I'll leave it at that. Suffice it to say. Okay, with that, we're going to jump into the next verse over here. This is verse number 18. And he does what he continues to like to do throughout the book, is that he starts one verse with the same words he started the last verse. I have to kind of like figure out what he's trying to do with that. It seems to be that he's either building on a point, or he's strengthening a point that he set. So let's try to work with that. But that is we've seen that. This is probably the 5th or 6th time that we've seen that, where he has one verse that starts off with a phrase, and then the next verse starts off with the same phrase. So it sounds like he's trying to build his argument through that repetition. Okay, so he says once again, Amarti ani belibi, I have said in my heart. Okay, again, I have said in my heart, al divrat b'nei ha'adam, on the matters of mankind, livaram ha'elokim, God has separated them. V'lirot shehem behema hema lahem, and to see that they are animals, they are to them. Okay, that's a great example of flowery Hebrew terminology, and he does a kind of a rhyming thing. He's actually been doing quite a bit of rhyming in this past couple verses, or like a poetic way of speaking. So let's read that again. Amarti ani b'libi, I have spoken in my heart, I've said in my heart, al divrat b'nei ha'adam, on the matters of mankind, liv oram ha'elokim, they have been separated by God, or perhaps they have been separated from God. Okay, we'll see about that. Vilirot, and it is to see, or it shows itself, shehem, that they, behema, hema, lahem, they are animals, they are to them. Okay, so that's again a kind of a repetitive statement. What he does is he rhymes this behema, hema, lahem, they are to them animals. Okay, so he's doing an interesting thing over here, where he is now saying that we are separated by God or separated from God, and that they are animals. We, meaning humankind, are animals. Now that's a pretty far distance, right? To be separated from God and then you're animal. That's a pretty long distance, I would think. Plus, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Let me read the verse one more time, because it's as Jacob pointed out, he's speaking from his heart, and he uses some funny sentence structure. So there it is right in front of us again. Thank you, Jacob, for pointing that out. So Amarti ani b'libi, I've spoken in my heart, al divrat b'nei hadam, on the matter of humankind, the sons of man, livaram ha'elokim, they have been separated by God, v'lirot shehem behema hema lahem, then, and to see that they are to them like animals, or that they are animals. Okay. Okay. So my understanding over here is now he's kind of building on this idea. So we have systems of justice that are corrupted by people who are not looking out for the vulnerable, people who are trying to take advantage of these systems of justice, the wicked taking advantage of these systems of justice, taking advantage of the counsel of the righteous, and instead using it for some other crooked purpose. And that's where you run into, again, in our kind of modern day example, you run into this idea of authoritarianism, of people who are utilizing the systems of justice, the systems that are put in place for the betterment of mankind. They're using them for some ulterior motive. And so on that, he's saying that this is something that we have to be, first of all, separated from God. So to take a second, when you separate two things, usually you're separating two things that are similar, right? Oil and water don't need separation. They are naturally separated. They're dissimilar enough that they separate themselves. When you have to do borer, when you have to separate something, to pick something out of something else, it's something that is similar to something else. So our go-to example, again, we always seem to fall onto the laws of Shabbat, is that one of the things that we are instructed not to do on Shabbat is to do borer, is to separate items from each other. Now, the quintessential example of that is if a person has crushed their grain, their wheat, and so now they've got kernels of grain and they've got the chaff, the skin, the sharp skin that sits on the wheat, and the person would go and pick out the good pieces from that. Right, that's something that a person is instructed not to do on Shabbat, and so that's borer. That's this exact word that we're talking about, liv aram helokim. So the idea of borer is, again, you have things that are similar that you have to go and pick out. So in that sense, we are very similar to God. And this person, a person who is trying, this wicked person who is trying to go and misuse the powers of society, the powers of justice and governance, that person is trying to do something that makes them godlike. They're reaching for godliness, not righteous godliness, but God, I would say omnipotence, trying to find some way of being like God in that sense. On that, God does a separation himself. Okay, God says this matter of mankind, that is meaning it's a fact of mankind. And again, as we mentioned 2 weeks ago, I think it was, it's a consistent theme. It happens over and over and over again in the history of mankind. It's almost inevitable, and it will likely continue to happen. But there are people who will try to take advantage of our systems of justice, and again, the systems of governance, for their own ulterior motives. They're trying to act like God, and God separates them from themselves. And it turns out, and what we see, the rest of us see, is that these people turn into animals. Okay? And now, we can easily say that somebody turns into, he acts like a behemoth, right? That's a common Yiddish bubbies like to use that term. You're acting like a behemoth, right? You're acting like an animal. But we're talking about King Solomon, so he's not just going to leave us with, you people are acting like animals, right? What is it that is compared? Why would we be compared to an animal? What is it about an animal that is that this person is compared to? And that he starts to get into in this next verse. So if everyone's ready, I'm just going to jump into our last verse for the day. That's verse number 19. All right, it's highlighted. And he starts to explain a little bit of the difference between mankind and what happens, what are some things that happen to men and animals, and what ends up being the kind of common denominator between these two groups. And so he says, Ki mikra v'nei ha'adam, the occurrence that happens to people, mikra, the shoresh there, the Hebrew root is this kuf resh hey, okay, mikra, which means an occurrence, usually what we would call happenstance, meaning that the things that happen to people in this case, umikra habehema, and the things that happen to animals, umikra echad lahem, they end up with the same things happening to them. Well, in what way? Kimot zeh, kain mot zeh. Like the way that this one dies too. V'ruach echad lakol, and there is one spirit, or literally a wind, for all of them. Umotar ha'adam min habehema ayin, and the advantages that man has over animals disappears. Ki hakol havel, because it is all havel. Again, that's our word havel, meaning this steam, this dissipating thing, what is often translated as futility, but we don't like to use that term. So that's a long verse. Let's take it apart one more time. Ki mikra v'nei ha'adam, the happenings that happen to a person. Umikra ha'behema, the happenings that happen to an animal. Umikra echad lahem, there is one happening that happens to both of them. Kimot zeh, the way that this one dies, kimot zeh, this one also dies. V'ruach echad lakol, and there is one spirit to all of them. Umotar ha'adam min habehema ayin, and the advantage that mankind has over animals is not there, it disappears. Ki hakol havel, because all of this really is havel, is this havel thing. Okay, and I found it helpful to see this from the point of view of the Mitzudah, which is one of the commentaries here, one of the commentaries throughout most of the Tanakh, and he points out over here that the way he interprets this is like this: that people have something that occurs to them, meaning for us, we have emotions. Humankind has emotions, right? We have things that take us in all sorts of different directions. They bring us up, they take us down, which has good aspects and bad aspects. But animals also have things that we don't have. Animals suffer from a lack of intelligence, right? They do not have the ability to discern the same way that humans do. So the advantage of humans would be that we have emotions, we have intelligence, we have something much greater than animals have. But what ends up happening is that at the end of the line, we end up the same way that they do. Okay, we can end up, or we do end up the same way. The way that this one dies, this one also dies. The same way an animal dies, a person also dies. And it's so in other words, that there is an innate and inherent advantage to humankind. We do have wisdom, we do have emotion, we have things that animals don't have. But what ends up happening is a person who misuses the systems of justice, like we're talking about, this wicked person, ends up in the same sense as the animal. And there's one spirit behind it. And the way I kind of understood this was, imagine a purely, the animal kingdom, right? We understand nowadays that the animal kingdom is run almost entirely on a Darwinian system, right? The survival of the fittest. It's whoever can make it, whoever survives, and it's about getting ahead in life. And that's literally what this person is trying to do, is taking advantage of whatever's in front of them to have the best things for themselves without caring about the other person. Well, that is where he's saying that's an animalistic thing. That is, it's a reality of the animal kingdom, and it's probably a reality of humankind also, that we tend to be selfish and be looking out for ourselves more than anybody else. But that is where he says you're going to end up with the same thing as animals. You're going to end up in the same level as an animal, because then you're just allowing yourself, without any regulation, you end up in the same sense as a purely Darwinian nightmare, right? Of trying to of pure survival of myself over everything else. And in that case, you lose any advantage that humankind has over animals. You lose that emotion, you lose that intelligence, you lose that, all those things that we said are an advantage of humankind, that ends up falling by the wayside and disappears. So again, you end up with this situation of umotar ha'adam min ha'behema ayin, that there ends up being no advantage to this person over an animal. Okay. Interestingly enough, is then he ends off with saying one last thing: ki hakol hava, because it's all hava. Now we have a system. The way we're understanding Kohelet is, whenever he says havel, that is a hint to us, not that this thing should be thrown out entirely, but that there's perhaps something to glean from it. It's going to take a lot of work to distill the steam and get water out of it. So he's not saying that he's saying that this is a terrible thing. He's saying that to be totally selfish and step on all the vulnerable people, really bad thing. But he also says that perhaps there's something to glean from it, and hopefully we'll discuss that in the coming weeks. Thank you all for joining us. Appreciate you coming. I'm going to exit the screen share. Okay. And hopefully I'll see you next week, once we're in the